Welcome to today's podcast of Sociology of the Family. I'm your host, Rachel Schweizer, and today our topic is Government Assistance Programs for Families in Israel. I have a special guest with me, Eli Katz. He is the Program Director for the TAB Center for Social Policy Studies in Israel. Welcome, Eli.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I know some of our listeners probably don't have a ton of information on Israel, so I wanted to get started with some background information. Eli, can you give us some history on the country?
Gladly. Modern-day Israel was established in 1948. It was largely a reaction to nearly 100,000 displaced people as a result of World War II and the Holocaust. Israel is the only country in the world that has a primarily Jewish population. It's small and densely populated, with limited resources, which makes it difficult, and it also has complex geopolitical circumstances. The land is considered holy by Jews, Muslims, and Christians, and there's ongoing conflict and disputes over land ownership between Israel, Palestinians, and neighboring Arab regions. In addition to a hostile region, there's also a volatile political environment. Despite these difficulties, though, the country has an elite military and a sophisticated economy. The U.S. has historically provided diplomatic and military support, as the region is often viewed globally as one of key importance to help maintain stability in the Middle East.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the population in Israel?
Sure. There's roughly 9 million people in the country. About 3/4 of those are Jews, and another 20% or so are Arab. Over time, the country has become a destination for migrants who are looking for labor and asylum, and over 3 million people have immigrated to Israel since the state was established. In terms of family structures, there's approximately 2 million nuclear families, which are identified as a mother and father family with children, and about 2.4 million households that have an average size of 3.32 people. In around 80% of houses, at least one member works. There's about 130,000 single-parent families in Israel, and interestingly, about 95% of those families are headed by single mothers.
I know in the U.S. there's a lot of single mothers in poverty. Could you tell us about the poverty conditions in Israel?
In Israel, single-parent households have a poverty rate of 35%, which is double that of partnered Israeli households. And half of single-parent families are reliant on public welfare assistance. In order to try to help single parents, the single-parent law was passed in 1992. The aim was to try and reduce the extent of poverty and income inequality and give special treatment to single parents. The law was then expanded later on in 1995, which increased the benefits to single-parent families, as well as expanded the population of eligible persons that could receive welfare benefits. The idea was this allowed single parents to work for a relatively high wage without completely losing their benefits. There were good and bad aspects of this change of legislation. Single mothers were potentially eligible for income support, had the incentivization to work, and tended to work more than their married counterparts, and it actually reduced the levels of poverty among single-parent families. Unfortunately, it also increased the dependency on welfare and reduced labor income. The law was later again revised, which included a steep reduction in welfare payments and benefits to single mothers, while at the same time introducing subsidies for employment. This led to employment rate growth for single mothers. However, because the payments were cut before the employment was subsidized, and it was during a period of a recession, there was an unfortunate effect that actually increased poverty rates for single-parent families and made it more difficult for them to climb out of poverty with the assistance of the government welfare system.
You mentioned governmental assistance. Can you expand upon what is available?
Similar to the U.S., Israel has what's called the National Insurance Institute, which is the country's social security agency that was founded in 1954. The organization pays a monthly allowance to families living in Israel who have children under the age of 18. This allowance is intended to help families who are raising children with their expenses regardless of their income level. When a child is born, the hospital submits information regarding the birth to the NII, who then pays an allowance automatically each month to the families until the child reaches the age of 18. This program is available to almost all. In order to qualify, parents have to either be Israeli citizens, a non-resident that lives with the child and has a work permit, and a residence in Israel for at least 6 months, have a biological child, or have a child that is under their care by guardian appointment from a court. The program even extends to adoptive parents, divorced parents, separated parents, legal guardians appointed by the court, and children who are under the age of 18 that have immigrated to Israel without their parents. Another unique feature of the NII is that it provides financial assistance and educational opportunities to families. Through the NII, a personal savings plan is created and is available for the child when they reach the age of 18. The account is managed by either a fund or a bank, and parents can contribute to it in addition to the money that the NII provides. The government views the savings plan as a right to all children in Israel, and the idea behind it is to enable children with an initial amount of money to start their adult life to help open new opportunities for them. In terms of education, single-parent families and families who have large numbers of children that also receive a child allowance and a substance benefit, such as general disability, income support, and so on, are eligible to receive a study grant at the beginning of each school year from the NII.
You mentioned education. Can you talk about what education in Israel looks like?
Israel's a fairly educated country. There's about 1.7 million students in Israel, and about 75% of those graduate high school. From the 1990s to the early 2000s, higher education saw rapid growth. However, it's since declined, and that's largely in part to budgetary cutbacks on institutes of higher education. There's around 250,000 students enrolled in college. While this number may appear low, it's tied to several social factors that are unique to Israel. Israel requires compulsory military service of around 2 to 3 years on average, and is the only democracy in the world that has a compulsory requirement for women. There's a few exceptions, of course. For example, Arab women, those with disabilities, those who are pregnant. A large number of citizens join the military immediately after high school, which then delays their enrollment in universities. What's interesting is that enrollment has increased in terms of the numbers of master's degree students, which could be due in part to rapid growth in emerging technology, life sciences, and financial sectors.
It's interesting that Israel has a required military service, as that's not something that we have in the US. From a sociological standpoint, I'd be curious to know how required military service impacts families. Are you able to provide any insight on that?
The Taub Center for Social Policy Studies in Israel is an independent, nonpartisan socioeconomic research institution. We look at high-quality, impartial research on socioeconomic conditions in Israel. One of the more interesting findings we've had is that gender arrangements in families of male and female career military personnel, as viewed by their civilian spouses, differ from normal civilian Israeli Jewish families. One of the reasons is heavy demands of the military, regardless of gender, leads to family arrangements that are constructed differently. There is traditional role division of labor occurring in families with servicemen, where the burden of the family work falls on the wives. Comparatively, similar demands placed on families with service women result in a division of labor that's more equal, and more of the burden of the family work is placed on the husbands. Married couples are increasingly sharing in the division of labor at home, and this is a changing perception that men have a greater share in family work. However, this differs considerably in military families. Military wives spend more time at home and are the primary caretakers. Over half of those women were unsatisfied with the family's division of labor. What's also interesting is that the division of labor and time allocation differs in families where women serve in the military. The roles are more egalitarian in nature and are much more so than the average Israeli family. What has resulted is that gender relations within the military, as well as families of service people, have been reconstructed. There have been expanded roles of women in the labor force, as well as the evolution of new family models, such as dual career and single parent families. The research is showing that family structures in Israel may not be that homogeneous, and that a struggle is occurring between the gender division of labor and each individual's own interest.
I'd be curious to know what family structures in Israel look like. Do these have an impact on what government assistance programs are available?
That's a great question, Rachel. There's many factors that impact how families are formed in Israel. To better understand the government assistance programs that are available to families, we need to first look at how Israelis define the family. Israelis seem to place great importance on the legal marriage framework compared to other types of living arrangements and childbearing. There seem to be more traditional attitudes towards families, as there's a high number of children per family, showing a less individualist and more child-centric orientation. While Israel is a democracy that has liberal social forces, it also has these unique traditional characteristics in terms of religious and traditional ethnic groups. A major social factor that influences the attitudes of families is the ongoing Israeli-Arab conflict. Israeli birth policies and regulations encourage the idea of increasing the Jewish population in response to a demographic threat of a growing Arab population. How Israelis perceive social constructs, such as the definition of family, are reflected through different laws, regulations, education, and attitudes. For example, civil marriages aren't legally allowed, and so same-sex couples only receive similar benefits as married couples on the basis of equality and their ability to parent. Social attitudes, such as the definition of family, are then shaped by conflicts between traditional views and democracy, as well as by religion and demographics. What this implies is that government assistance programs are designed to assist parenthood and not really parents.
You mentioned poverty in Israel and how family structures are influenced by attitudes. It sounds like you're saying government assistance programs may not be adequate. Are there economic trends that are also impacting this?
I'm glad that you mentioned that, Rachel. Israel has a very high cost of living. Families face considerable expenses, especially when it comes to housing and education. Rising housing costs have pushed the number of families with children into renting. Families with young children have high employment and consistent employment rates. However, the state-funded assistance for them is lower compared to other OECD countries. For instance, Israel doesn't have any framework to give young people who are students or performing their military duties any additional allowances like other countries. Compared to other countries, there's a gap, and this gap leads to a belief that there could be governmental policies that can provide better assistance to families that have young children. One of the proposed ways to do this is that the state of Israel could impose a higher tax on parents when their income is greater later in life and the children are out of the home. This would be, of course, due to their longevity in the employment market. As I mentioned, the country has a high cost of living, which is one of the highest in the developed world. At the same time, wages are really low, which creates an economic inequality. The average house in Israel makes around $65,000. Housing accounts for 25% of monthly expenses, followed by transportation and communication costs and food. While half of the population is in the labor force, men actually comprise about 12% more of the workforce than women. This income inequality has decreased over the last 10 years as wages have continued to rise in low-earning industries due to increased minimum wage and demand for labor. However, women still face income inequality. Compared to men, women earn 32% less. This is likely because they tend to work fewer hours and be employed in industries that pay lower wages. Similar to poverty in the US, these wage gaps impact the ability of single mother families to increase their social mobility and escape poverty, which then leads to them being more reliant on government assistance programs. As I mentioned before, Israel has a high poverty rate, which is actually the second highest child poverty rate among developed countries, and 1 in 4 children live below the poverty line. These numbers are even greater in Arab Israeli and Orthodox Jewish households. This could be due to political and religious tensions, as well as resistance to living in a modern world.
If the economy is acting as a structural factor, what about education? You mentioned the number of students attending universities is low, so I'm curious whether education is another structural factor that impacts governmental assistance.
Absolutely, though I'll say this is a complicated factor that is impacted by many variables. Israel has a high level of occupational gender segregation. Women account for nearly half of students in higher education. However, there's still a high percentage of them who are employed in the fields of education and therapy, likely due to the flexible hours and part-time options that these fields provide. And very few are employed in high-tech operations. One way to get around this is to have programs that are designed to help women enter technology and science-based industries, which could then help narrow this gap. Another issue is economic inequality varies by the different socioeconomic and ethnic groups in Israel, which continues to widen the gap of educational inequality. For example, there's a high percentage of Jews who attend universities, and Jews have lower dropout rates than Arabs do. These gaps in higher education might be narrowed if there were programs and encouragement to obtain advanced degrees in order to find better employment opportunities. Another challenge is that educational inequalities exist in terms of resource availability. This is due not only to family resources, but also how the education system in Israel is structured. For example, students in Israel are separated based on whether they're strong or weak. There's also been a privatization of schools. So what happens is there's been a gap in education that grows when strong or affluent students are given more resources compared to those weaker or poorer students. As I mentioned before, poverty also has an impact on educational success. For example, there's been research that's shown that there's a strong negative correlation for children who experience poverty during the first 2 years of their life and later academic achievements. Even though the government has efforts focused on improving early childhood education and created the program Savings for Every Child that I mentioned earlier, the economic inequality is so widespread that it makes it challenging to narrow this gap among different socioeconomic and ethnic groups. One proposed program that would be helpful in terms of a long-term strategy is to have better funding and more targeted approaches to young parents, particularly single mothers, as this could give parents and children a better chance of escaping poverty.
We've talked about broad structural factors such as the economy and education, but what about cultural factors? Does that play a part in the terms of how the government assistance programs are designed?
I'm glad that you mentioned that. This is the area that I personally find very interesting. As we discussed, women in Israel are perceived to be the primary caregivers for children and bear the greater division of household labor. Since many high-paying fields such as science, technology, and engineering do not offer work schedule flexibility, many women in turn seek out fields that do provide these benefits. Since the NII gives families subsidies for children, there may be less of an incentive for women to seek out these high-paying professions that could provide them with work-life balance. There are also differences between the religious community and the secular community. For example, non-Orthodox men often work in the military or high-paying industries, whereas Orthodox men are more focused on religious education and responsibilities. Similarly, women in non-Orthodox Jewish households work over 50%, in fact, as compared to only 13% in Orthodox households. This implies that women are perceived to be the primary caretakers of both the children in the home, and men are out working and focusing on their religious education. There's an important cultural factor, though, that we haven't talked about yet, which impacts government assistance programs. Israel's population is changing. There's a few trends that are impacting this. Israel's demography is unique. Around 80% of the population grows due to natural growth, and 20% comes from international immigration, which has increased steadily over the last 20 years. Presently, the largest number of immigrants are coming from Russia, Ukraine, and France, most of whom are under the age of 40. These relatively young immigrants tend to have a hard time mastering the Hebrew language and finding jobs that match their skill sets. Since they have difficulty finding well-paying jobs, they end up being more reliant on government assistance programs for housing, taxes, and economics. If you put migration to the side for a moment, Israel has one of the highest birth rates in the developed world. In addition to the push I mentioned earlier for larger Jewish populations, IVF treatments and advancements in medical technology have had an effect. I find it interesting that these rates are declining for women under the age of 25 and increasing for women over the age of 30. This implies that women are delaying having children until later ages, many whom are single parents. Interestingly, the number of Jewish women is growing and their fertility rate is stable. In contrast, the number of Arab women is staying constant, yet their fertility rates are declining. What this means is that over the next 20 years, the population will age and birth rates will increase in about 10 years when large numbers of women reach childbearing age.
We've talked a lot about the broad structural and cultural factors that impact trends. Sociology looks at social changes and trends over time. With all this information, what kinds of implications exist in terms of the adequacy of governmental assistance programs and how they may need to evolve going forward?
To really answer that question, we need to look at it both on the macro level and the micro level. On the macro level, high fertility rates and growing immigrant populations means there are potentially more people that are reliant on government assistance. Therefore, government policies and programs are needed to help integrate these large numbers of people into both higher education and the labor market. At the same time, population growth challenges government assistance programs. Despite the fact that wages and the poverty line have increased over the last 10 years, income and child benefit support programs have not increased accordingly and are insufficient to meet the country's needs. Additionally, other programs such as the Savings for Every Child are not specifically targeted at people living in poverty who are in the most need of government assistance. Parents from lower socioeconomic status levels do not contribute as much to the state contribution as compared to parents from higher socioeconomic status levels. In turn, this means social mobility for children is flattened and the economic inequality gap stays constant. To help decrease poverty rates, government resources could be better allocated towards early childhood education and young parents. We also need to look at the micro-level implications. As the cost of living continues to rise, state assistance is inadequate. This leads to many elderly being forced to return to live with their children. What this creates is a new generation of adults who are taking care of both their parents and their children at the same time. Additionally, there's a large pension savings gap between men and women, especially those over the age of 45, and an aging population that's living longer. So as this population ages, Israel will need better planning in terms of pensions and long-term care services to help offset the rising cost of living. Another trend that we need to look at is the age at which women are choosing to have children in Israel. This is on the rise. First births are getting pushed to later ages, and more single women are utilizing advanced medical technologies to get pregnant. The implication here is that by delaying childbirth, women are increasing their education and income earning potential, in addition to potentially other underlying sociological trends that are affecting the marriage pool. Similar to elderly population changes, reform is going to be needed to government assistance programs that's going to adapt to these changing populations.
That's all the time we have for this week's episode. I want to thank Eli Katz for joining us and providing some great sociological insights into Israeli society.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Rachel.
Be sure to tune in next week when we look at global maternity leave programs compared to the U.S. Good night, everyone.